When an arrogant rich kid caused a scene in a diner, humiliating a tired waitress, throwing food at her feet, and shouting at everyone, no one dared to step in, until one quiet man in the corner finally stood up. No one knew who he was, but a minute later, everyone saw just how fast arrogance collapses when it meets real strength. Subscribe, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Would you step in if you were in Chuck's place? The morning in the small roadside cafe began like countless others before it. A pale beam of sunlight crept in through the old aluminum blinds, laying narrow silver stripes across the glossy red booths and the black and white checkered floor that had been polished so many times the tiles had begun to thin. The faint hum of a refrigerator, the muted clatter of plates from the kitchen, and the soft hiss of bacon frying on the grill blended into a familiar soundtrack that everyone who regularly came here had grown to love. This was a place where truckers paused between long highway stretches, where retired locals nursed a cup of coffee for an hour just to chat, and where people came to feel the comfort of routine. The cafe wasn't fancy, but it didn't need to be. It had soul. The waitress moved between the tables with the slow, precise motions of someone who had repeated these steps so many times that her body no longer required thought to perform them. Her name tag read Doris, though hardly anyone used it. Most people simply called her ma'am. She was a woman in her late 40s, maybe early 50s, though the exhaustion in her eyes made her seem older on some mornings. Today was one of those mornings. She had been working double shifts for 3 weeks straight. Bills were piling up at home, and her second job cleaning motel rooms was drying up because of the season. Her daughter needed new textbooks, her son needed new sneakers for school, and her mother's medication cost more every month. Doris had learned to live with the weight of responsibility pressing on her shoulders, but some days it dug deeper than others. She still wore her uniform with pride. The faded pink dress with white cuffs and buttons fit a little too tightly around the arms now, and her apron had been patched in 2 different places where it had torn. Her hair, pinned up in a neat bun, included a few stubborn strands of gray she no longer bothered to hide. The smell of fresh coffee clung to her clothing and hands, something she barely noticed anymore. Doris had grown used to aching feet, to the tiny burn marks on her fingers from hot plates, and to the constant awareness that she was expected to smile even when life offered little to smile about. Still, she tried. She always tried. A couple sat near the window, sharing a plate of pancakes. The man in the booth across from them, a mechanic with oil permanently embedded beneath his fingernails, sipped from his chipped mug while scanning the local newspaper. And at the far corner, near the last booth against the wall, sat a man who blended seamlessly into the scenery, as if the cafe had been built around him. He was tall, wearing a worn plaid shirt and denim jeans, with a brown cowboy hat resting squarely on his head. His presence didn't demand attention, but it held a quiet gravity. His coffee sat untouched in front of him, steam curling upward as he watched the slow rhythm of the morning unfold. Most people didn't notice him. He preferred it that way. Everything changed the moment the cafe door slammed open, with a force that made several heads turn. A young man stormed in as if he owned the place, his expensive sneakers squeaking sharply against the floor. His hoodie was black and brand new, its fabric still stiff, the kind of brand people bragged about on social media. He reeked of cologne too sweet, too heavy, too eager to cover something unpleasant beneath. His eyes darted across the room, not in curiosity but in superiority, taking in the faces of ordinary people he believed were beneath him. He moved with the entitled swagger of someone raised without consequences, someone who'd been told his whole life that the world would bend before him simply because of who his father was. When Doris approached his table, offering a gentle welcome despite her fatigue, the young man didn't even bother to look at her. He tossed the menu onto the table without opening it and waved his hand dismissively. She asked what he would like to order, and he answered with the kind of tone people used when talking to a malfunctioning machine. He spoke quickly, impatiently, as though the mere act of addressing her irritated him. As she walked away, a sickening twist formed in her stomach. She had seen people like him before, although not often, the kind who viewed kindness as weakness, the kind who thrived on the discomfort of others. She whispered a quiet prayer under her breath that he would eat and leave quickly. When she returned with his order, carefully prepared, placed neatly on a clean plate, he barely glanced at it. Instead, he looked at Doris as though she had done something offensive by existing within his line of sight. Without warning, he leaned forward, examined the sandwich with dramatic disgust, and then, in a gesture so abrupt the entire cafe seemed to flinch, he spat directly into the plate. A gasp escaped from someone nearby. Doris didn't react at first. She simply looked at the plate, then at the man, her eyes freezing in shock. Her heart sank, but her voice remained caught somewhere inside her throat. He shoved the plate forward with his palm, pushing it off the table. It clattered to the floor, the sandwich scattering beside her shoes. Even then, she tried to remain composed. She bent to pick up the pieces, her hands trembling only slightly. The young man wasn't finished. He leaned back, lifted both feet off the ground, and slammed them onto the table, tracking dirt from the soles of his sneakers across the polished white surface. Then he pulled out his phone and pointed the camera toward Doris. A grin curled on his lips, a twisted expression of triumph. He was recording, capturing her humiliation as if it were nothing more than entertainment for his followers. His voice rose above the quiet murmur of the cafe, announcing his disdain for the food, the service, the entire establishment. His laughter cut through Doris's thin composure, each sound sharp as broken glass. People turned away, not because they didn't care, but because they felt powerless. They had seen situations like this before, wealth shielding cruelty, privilege enabling arrogance. No one wanted trouble, especially not with someone whose father's name could shut down a business with a single phone call. The mechanic lowered his gaze to the newspaper. The couple by the window held hands under the table, tense and unsure. Even the owner of the cafe, who stood behind the counter wiping glasses, hesitated. His eyes flicked between the young man and Doris, torn between protecting his employee and protecting his business. In the far corner, the man in the cowboy hat watched quietly. He didn't shift in his seat, didn't gesture, didn't speak, but his eyes, steady and perceptive, caught every detail. The cruelty in the boy's smile, the trembling of Doris's hands, the silence weighing on the room. Something in him stirred, a slow, silent current beneath the surface. He didn't move yet, but the moment was coming. The boy laughed again, louder this time, lifting his phone higher as he zoomed in on Doris's distressed face. Her lips trembled, her shoulders sagged. She had endured rude customers, impatient customers, demanding customers. But this felt different. This felt like someone stripping her dignity away piece by piece, enjoying every second. She swallowed hard and whispered an apology she didn't owe. But the boy only smirked, pointing at her with a mocking tilt of his chin. And still the man in the cowboy hat watched. His coffee, untouched, had long since cooled. He didn't seem to notice. His expression didn't change, but something in the air did, a shift so subtle only the most observant would sense it. It was the quiet before something inevitable. The young man continued filming, continued mocking, continued escalating his performance for an audience that wasn't even there. The cafe's morning peace was gone. In its place hung a heavy silence, filled with the unspoken wish that anyone would do something. Someone would, but not yet. Not until the line was crossed so clearly that even the quiet man in the corner could no longer remain still. The silence that settled over the cafe after the young man's outburst was heavy and suffocating, the kind of silence that makes people shrink into their seats and pretend they are invisible. Doris stood frozen, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her knuckles pale, her lips pressed together as if trying to hold back every emotion threatening to escape. Her throat felt tight, her heart hammered in her chest, and the humiliation washed over her like a cold wave. She had endured insults in her years of work, endured long shifts, pain, exhaustion, and the occasional rude customer who thought a waitress's smile was part of the meal price. But this was something darker. This was cruelty for the sake of cruelty. She closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself, and tried to breathe through the ache. Her instincts told her to walk away, to hide in the kitchen until her trembling stopped. But she was a professional, a mother raising 2 children alone, a woman who couldn't afford to break down in the middle of her shift. She bent her head slightly, attempting to regain her composure before looking up at the young man again. He was still recording her, enjoying her discomfort as if it were a stage performance. Gathering what courage she had left, Doris stepped toward the table to clean up the fallen food. Her movements were careful, almost delicate, as though she feared provoking him simply by existing. She reached down to pick up the sandwich pieces scattered by her feet. Her fingers brushed against the cold tile, and she felt the sting of tears rising, but she didn't let them fall. She wouldn't give him that victory, but when she straightened up, the young man leaned forward, his face twisted into an exaggerated expression of mocking pity that made her chest tighten. He extended his hand abruptly, and Doris instinctively stepped back. But the boy wasn't finished. He thrust his fingers toward her apron and brushed them against the white fabric with deliberate slowness, wiping invisible dirt from them as if she were a cleaning rag instead of a human being. The touch was brief yet powerful in its intent, a gesture drenched in contempt. Doris flinched, and for the first time, she saw the fear in her own reflection in his phone screen. It unsettled her deeply. A ripple moved through the cafe. An elderly woman in one of the booths whispered something to her husband, her voice trembling with disapproval. The mechanic lowered his newspaper and stared openly now, his brow furrowed. But none of them moved, and none of them spoke loudly enough to be heard. They watched like an audience, unable to intervene in a play whose ending they dreaded, but felt powerless to change. The owner behind the counter glanced nervously at the young man, then at Doris, trapped between fear for his employee's safety and fear of the repercussions from confronting the son of a wealthy and powerful man. His indecision tightened the tension in the air, a palpable pressure that made everyone's breaths shallow. The young man leaned back in his seat again. He lifted his chin and opened his mouth wide for a loud, cruel laugh that echoed off the walls. His amusement filled every corner of the room. Then, as if to ensure no one missed the extent of his disrespect, he deliberately formed a slow, smug gesture with his hand, raising his middle finger straight at Doris. He held it there, steady, unwavering, his expression daring her to react, daring anyone to challenge him. Doris felt the heat rise in her face, the kind that burns from humiliation rather than anger. She tried to turn away, but he wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his eyes glinting with a kind of performative malice, and spat on the floor near her shoes. A small drop of saliva landed near the edge of her uniform, and the room seemed to tilt for a moment. Doris's breath hitched, her shoulders curled inward, as though trying to protect something fragile deep inside her. He continued with his monologue, loud, obnoxious, dripping with entitlement, complaining about the cafe, the food, the service, her appearance, anything he could use to keep the spotlight on himself. He demanded a free dessert, claimed emotional damage over the terrible food, and threatened to call the health department, the newspaper, his lawyer, his father, any authority he believed he controlled. His synthetic confidence radiated through the room, suffocating and heavy. In the far booth, the man in the cowboy hat watched everything with a steady, unmoving gaze. His face remained calm, but beneath that stillness was a slow, growing tension that seemed to settle in his shoulders and jaw. His fingers curled around the ceramic coffee cup, though he didn't lift it. He observed Doris's trembling posture, the shame in her eyes, and the way everyone in the room seemed paralyzed by hesitation. His expression didn't change, but something in his gaze sharpened, a quiet shift, imperceptible to most. And still, he waited. The young man wasn't satisfied yet. He picked up a remaining piece of sandwich from his plate and held it between his fingers, turning it over with an exaggerated look of disgust. Then, with calculated spite, he let it fall toward Doris's apron. It bounced off the fabric and landed at her feet. The impact was small, but the meaning behind it was crushing. Doris recoiled as if struck. Her breath stuttered, and her vision blurred for a moment behind tears she forced herself not to shed. A murmured wave passed through the cafe. A couple of customers exchanged glances, others shifted uncomfortably in their booths. The mechanic shook his head in silent judgment, but his hands remained fixed to the table. The owner looked away, as though unable to bear witness to the scene unfolding in front of him. The young man enjoyed every second. His grin widened, fueled by the obedience of a room full of adults who allowed him to behave like a king in a broken kingdom. He basked in the silence, mistaking it for fear of him, fear of his family's influence, fear of crossing someone with enough power to ruin their lives. But not everyone in the cafe saw silence as surrender. The man in the cowboy hat slowly set his cup down. His eyes followed the boy, not with hostility, but with a firm, assessing focus. He observed the way the young man used cruelty as performance, the way he exploited Doris's vulnerability for amusement, the way he relished the lack of resistance. He had seen men like this before, men who believed themselves untouchable because the world had never told them otherwise, men who had been taught that indifference was strength and kindness was weakness, men who pushed until someone finally pushed back. But he didn't move yet. He wanted to see whether the boy was simply bluffing, whether someone else in the cafe might step forward, whether reason might intervene. But no one stood. No one spoke. And the boy continued, escalating with every passing moment, eager to prove to himself that he was the most powerful person in the room. Doris swallowed hard and took a small step backward, trying to distance herself from the harassment. But the boy leaned forward again, his posture predatory. He lifted another piece of food and toyed with it, as though calculating how to humiliate her further. In that instant, something changed. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It wasn't a gasp or a shout or a crash of plates. It was something quiet, internal, subtle, and deeply human. A line had been crossed, not by the boy alone, but by the room's collective silence. The man in the cowboy hat rose slowly from his seat. It was not a dramatic movement. He didn't slam his hands on the table or challenge anyone with words. He simply stood up, his posture calm and steady, the kind of deliberateness that draws attention without demanding it. His shadow stretched across the booth as he stepped forward, his boots echoing softly against the tile. The customers looked up, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. Doris glanced at him, confusion mixing with exhaustion in her eyes. The young man, still smirking, didn't immediately notice, but the cafe itself seemed to exhale. Relief, hope, uncertainty all tangled together as the man in the cowboy hat began walking toward the scene that everyone else had been too afraid to approach. He had waited long enough. The man in the cowboy hat walked forward with a slow, measured stride that seemed to alter the entire atmosphere of the cafe. The hum of tension that had permeated the air grew heavier, as though every breath taken by the customers had been drawn in at once. Chairs creaked softly as a few people shifted in their seats, unable to look away. The owner behind the counter froze mid-motion, a half-wiped glass in his hand. Even the fluorescent lights above seemed to buzz more quietly, as though dimming themselves in anticipation. Doris stepped back instinctively when she noticed him approaching. For a second, she thought he might simply be leaving another customer, quietly slipping out to avoid further discomfort. But as he neared her, she saw a calm purpose in his eyes, something steady and grounded, like a deeply rooted tree that storms could not sway. His presence felt protective in a way that made her chest tighten with emotions she couldn't process all at once. She didn't know who he was, but something about him, the quiet confidence, the lack of aggression, made her feel a little less alone. The young man still had his back partially turned, his attention fixed on his phone as he angled it to capture Doris from the most humiliating vantage point. He chuckled under his breath, checking the lighting, adjusting the angle, making the moment as dramatic as he could for his unseen audience. He seemed to be crafting a cruel narrative, one in which he was the star and Doris was the punchline. He was so absorbed in his own performance that he didn't realize someone was stepping into his frame until the shadow of a broad shoulder interrupted his view. He glanced up, annoyed, expecting to see someone apologizing or scurrying out of the way. Instead, he found himself looking into the calm, unwavering eyes of the man in the cowboy hat. The young man blinked, his expression sliding from irritation to confusion. He tilted his head as though trying to understand why anyone would dare stand between him and his spectacle. He adjusted his posture, straightening in his seat and raising his chin, a spark of arrogance igniting in his eyes. The cowboy didn't speak at first. He simply positioned himself between Doris and the boy, blocking her from the phone camera and breaking the line of confrontation. His broad frame shielded her entirely, creating a small island of safety behind him. Doris hesitated, unsure whether to step back further or stay where she was, but she ultimately remained still, her eyes fixed on his back as though it were a fortress. The young man scoffed, lowering his phone just enough to glance around at the people watching. The cafe was silent, and that silence offended him. He had wanted their laughter, their shock, their attention, but not like this. Not directed at him. Not because someone had stepped in. His fingers tightened around the phone as he leaned forward. He wanted the man to feel small, to feel overpowered, to regret stepping into something that wasn't his business. He needed to reclaim control of the room. He rose slowly from his chair, dragging the legs of the seat across the floor with a screech that set everyone's teeth on edge. He stepped closer until he stood face to face with the cowboy, though even on his feet he had to tilt his head slightly upward. His breath smelled faintly of expensive gum and entitlement. The man in the cowboy hat didn't waver. He didn't step back, didn't raise a hand, didn't tense his body. He simply looked at the boy with a calm steadiness that made the young man's skin prickle. There was no judgment in his eyes, no anger, no fear, only quiet resolve. It was a kind of confidence the boy had never encountered, a confidence that didn't need shouting or posturing. That alone enraged him. The young man took a step closer, invading the cowboy's personal space in a way he had done to Doris moments earlier. He smirked, raising his eyebrows as if expecting a flinch, but the cowboy remained unmoving. The boy didn't like being ignored, didn't like the idea that someone might not take him seriously. His face twisted with frustration. He took another step forward, the brim of the cowboy's hat nearly brushing his forehead. He tilted his phone upward and restarted the recording, framing the shot so he could show the world how he put some old dude in his place. He made exaggerated expressions of fake sympathy, mock confusion, and disbelief, all of it designed for the camera. But something was different now. The cafe wasn't laughing. No one was amused. Even the people who had watched silently before, too afraid or too uncertain to intervene, were now focused entirely on the growing tension between the two men. The cowboy finally spoke, his voice low but clear. He wasn't threatening, wasn't loud. His words were simple, a polite but firm request for the young man to leave the cafe and stop harassing the staff. The boy's face twitched. For a moment he seemed genuinely stunned. Someone had told him no. Someone had told him to leave. Someone had challenged him without trembling. His expression crumpled into something sharp and angry. He forced out a laugh, loud and derisive, trying to reclaim the room. But it sounded strained, brittle. He shifted his stance, straightened his shoulders, and pointed the camera directly at the cowboy's face. He wanted to provoke him, wanted to catch a reaction he could twist into something that painted himself as the victim. But the cowboy simply stood there, unshaken. The boy's frustration boiled into fury. He raised his middle finger again, this time inches from the cowboy's face, holding it there with dramatic intent. The gesture was childish, but the venom behind it was real. He sneered, confident that the man would finally snap, or at least step back. When the cowboy didn't even blink, the young man's temper flared. He grabbed a piece of food from the table, something messy, something sticky, and hurled it toward Doris, who was still standing behind the cowboy. The food splattered harmlessly against the wall because the cowboy had stepped slightly to block her from view. It smeared against his boot instead. The room gasped. The young man's chest puffed out as he interpreted this as victory, as dominance achieved. The thrill of power coursed through him, an electric arrogance that made him grin. But the cowboy merely lowered his gaze to his boot, then back to the boy, his expression unchanged. The young man suddenly felt small, though he didn't understand why. Something inside him burned embarrassment, insecurity, the fear of being seen for what he truly was. Weak. He needed to regain control. He needed to show everyone that he wasn't afraid. He shoved his chair further aside and took a half step back, only to lunge forward again. His body moved with the reckless momentum of someone who had never been challenged physically, someone who mistook anger for strength. He jerked his leg up, twisting his hips, and aimed a wild, unruly kick at the cowboy's chest. It wasn't skillful. It wasn't precise. It was the desperate move of a boy whose ego had been threatened. The entire cafe seemed to inhale sharply at once, as though bracing for inevitable impact. Doris felt her heart stop. The mechanic rose slightly from his booth, unsure whether to intervene. The elderly couple clutched hands, eyes wide. The cowboy, however, moved with the controlled ease of someone who had lived through storms far worse than this. The kick hadn't landed yet, but the moment it began, when the young man's foot left the ground and his face twisted in aggression, something shifted in the cowboy's stance. He lowered his center of gravity by a fraction, his shoulders relaxing instead of tensing, his posture steady as a mountain. Everyone in the cafe felt the tension in the air crystallize. This moment was no longer about spilled food or insults or even humiliation. It had become a line drawn unmistakably in the sand. The boy had crossed into a territory he couldn't take back, and the cowboy had been forced into a role he never sought but could no longer avoid. The young man's foot swung forward, and the cowboy was ready. The kick that the young man launched toward the cowboy was clumsy and impulsive, a burst of rage rather than a calculated strike. His legs swung forward with all the graceless momentum of someone who had never needed to fight for anything in his life. It was an attempt to assert dominance, to intimidate, to create a moment he could later brag about, but it was also the moment that shattered the fragile illusion he had built around himself. And before his foot even reached its target, the cowboy reacted. The man in the hat moved with a speed that contrasted sharply with the slow, patient calm he had displayed moments earlier. His hand came up smoothly, capturing the young man's ankle midair. The motion was fluid, almost gentle in its precision, yet it halted the attack instantly. The boy's eyes widened in disbelief as his body wobbled, his balance lost the second his foot was no longer under his control. The cowboy's grip was firm but not cruel, steady enough to show complete mastery of the situation without inflicting pain. For an instant, time seemed to freeze. The cafe suspended itself in a breathless silence. The mechanic, halfway risen from his booth, remained frozen in that posture. The elderly couple clung to each other, their faces pale with tension. Doris stared with wide eyes from behind the cowboy, her hands trembling against her apron. She didn't dare speak. She didn't dare move. The young man let out a startled sound, something between a gasp and a choke, as the cowboy gently but decisively shifted his foot downward. The movement sent the boy stumbling backward. His heels slid across the floor, his arms flailed wildly as he tried to steady himself. The cowboy didn't advance, didn't posture, didn't threaten. He stood perfectly still, his body relaxed, his eyes calm. It was the young man's own momentum, his own unchecked anger, that stripped him of balance and made him look foolish. He caught himself on the edge of a table, breath ragged, cheeks flushed red. Shock overtook his expression, first shock that anyone had dared touch him, shock that he'd been stopped so easily, shock that his attempt to block the room with bravado had shattered in a heartbeat. But that shock quickly boiled over into something much more volatile: embarrassment, humiliation, fear. These emotions churned inside him with a heat he didn't know how to manage. He had always been the one who dominated the room, controlled the narrative, laughed while others cowered. Now he was the one standing off balance, his chest heaving, his confidence leaking out of him like air from a punctured tire. He felt smaller than he ever had, and the sensation clawed at his ego with savage desperation. He clenched his fists, his jaw tightened, his face twisted with a rage that stemmed more from wounded pride than anything else. He lifted his phone again, thrusting it forward as if the device could save him, could restore the control he had lost. He pointed the camera straight at the cowboy's face and forced out a laugh that cracked halfway through. "Look at this," he screamed, his voice shriller than before, though he was still trying to maintain the swagger. "This guy thinks he can—" But the cowboy made no move. He didn't respond. He didn't even speak. He simply held the boy's gaze with a quiet intensity that stopped the tirade cold. It was not a stare of dominance or intimidation. Rather, it was a look that saw straight through the facade, right into the hollow fear beneath. The boy's voice faltered. His hand trembled slightly as he held the phone. He had no idea why he felt compelled to step backward, but he did. He swallowed hard and tried to recover. He straightened his hoodie, shoved a hand through his hair, trying to reassemble the mask he always wore. His pride clung to him like a lifeline. He needed to prove that he still had power, that he could still make someone hurt, that the cafe belonged to him, not to the quiet stranger who had dared interrupt his performance. He turned his attention back to Doris. His eyes narrowed. If he couldn't dominate the cowboy, he could at least reassert control over her. He grabbed the last remaining bit of food from his plate, cold, soggy, and crushed and hurled it in her direction. It flew crookedly, wobbling in the air. But before it could reach her, the cowboy shifted his weight just enough that the mushy piece splattered against his boot instead. He didn't flinch. He didn't look down. He placed himself between Doris and the attack without hesitation, without ceremony. The young man's chest rose and fell rapidly, fury burning in his eyes. But beneath that fury was panic. He could feel the room turning against him. The silence that had once empowered him now suffocated him. People were no longer looking away. They were witnessing his unraveling. Their faces showed not fear, but disappointment, disapproval. Something he had never encountered in a public space without someone rushing to smooth things over for him. His breath hitched. He needed this to stop. He needed them to look at him the way they used to. He forced out a loud laugh, but it sounded hollow. He widened his stance in a pose meant to look threatening, but his legs shook slightly. He raised his phone, but his hand was unsteady. He screamed at the cowboy to back off. He screamed that his father would sue. He screamed that he would shut this whole pathetic dump down. But the cowboy didn't move. He didn't react. He simply remained there, steady as stone, protecting the trembling woman behind him. Something inside the young man cracked. This wasn't going according to plan. Suddenly desperate, he lunged again. Not with a kick this time. He wanted to shove the cowboy aside, force him back, make him yield. He threw his whole body forward like a wave, hoping momentum would carry him through. His hands reached out, fingers spread, his expression twisted with frantic anger. But as he surged forward, the cowboy shifted his stance with the grace of someone who had been trained not to fight, but to end fights quickly and decisively. He sidestepped by an inch, one fluid movement that carried the young man past him. And then, with a controlled motion, he placed his hand on the boy's shoulder, not forcefully, but with enough leverage to redirect the reckless energy. The young man slammed to the ground. It wasn't violent. It wasn't cruel. It was simply physics meeting desperation. His phone flew from his hand and skidded across the tile floor. He landed flat on his stomach, palms scraping against the cold surface. The fall knocked the wind out of him, leaving him gasping, dazed, and momentarily stunned. The cafe erupted in a collective gasp. For a long moment, no one moved. The cowboy stood above the young man, composed and silent. He had used no excessive force, no anger, no retaliation. He simply ensured the boy could no longer harm anyone. The young man lifted his head slowly, his face flushing red. His pride lay shattered on the floor beside him, more broken than his scraped palms. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an ally, a sympathetic gaze, anything. But all he saw were witnesses. Witnesses who had seen his cruelty, his tantrum, his fall. He pushed himself up onto his knees, breaths ragged and uneven. The room felt smaller somehow, oppressive in its quiet. He could feel their eyes piercing through him, peeling away the layers of arrogance he'd worn so proudly. His chest tightened with a feeling he barely recognized, shame. The cowboy still hadn't moved. The young man glared up at him with trembling fury, but beneath that fury was something raw and unfamiliar. This was the first time in his life that someone had stopped him. That someone had told him enough. That someone had stripped away the power he thought he possessed. His voice cracked when he finally spoke again, though he tried to hide it behind a sneer. But the words didn't matter anymore. They were empty, powerless, meaningless against the reality of what had just happened. The cafe remained silent, waiting. The moment stretched, thick with the understanding that what came next would shape everything that followed. The young man pushed himself unsteadily to his feet, and now for the first time, he was the one who looked small. For a long moment after the young man staggered to his feet, the cafe seemed suspended in a breathless stillness. The contours of the room sharpened, the gleam of the metal napkin dispensers, the bright lines of sunlight slanting across the floor, the faint swish of the ceiling fan's blades cutting through the air. It was as though every sense had heightened, collectively bracing for whatever would follow. The young man swayed slightly, his breath unsteady, his face flushed with a complex mix of anger and humiliation. His bravado had vanished. What remained behind his eyes was a raw uncertainty he did not know how to mask. His gaze fixed on the cowboy, trembling not from physical pain, but from the realization that his entire facade had been fractured in front of an audience. He wanted to shout, to curse, to threaten. But each time he opened his mouth, no sound emerged. Fear, real fear, tightened around his throat like a vice. He looked around in desperation, searching for even one person who might offer him a sympathetic glance, someone who might validate his indignation or restore his sense of control. But every face he met held the same expression: quiet condemnation, disappointment, or lingering shock. The mechanic leaned back slowly into his booth, his eyes still locked on the scene. The elderly couple watched with held breath, their hands intertwined more tightly than before. Even the customers, who had earlier tried to distance themselves, felt compelled to witness the unfolding moment. The silence pressed in from all sides, oppressive and unyielding, leaving the young man exposed. The cowboy remained still, his posture relaxed yet unmistakably firm. He didn't gloat or smirk or revel in the young man's humiliation. His expression didn't even change. He simply stood as a barrier between the boy and Doris, between cruelty and safety. His calmness only seemed to deepen the young man's panic. There was no malice coming from him, no aggression, no threat. But it was precisely the absence of those things that unsettled the boy most. It meant that everything that had just happened had been entirely his own doing. The young man's breathing became sharper. He snatched a quick glance toward his phone lying several feet away on the tile, as if it were a lifeline he desperately needed to grasp. He took a step toward it, but his hands shook as he reached for the device, betraying the fact that he no longer felt in control of any part of himself. His fingers curled around the phone, but he held it with a kind of numb uncertainty, no longer brandishing it like a weapon. It slipped slightly in his grip, slick with sweat. He rose slowly, adjusting his hoodie with a shaky hand, as though trying to reassemble the fragments of his composure. But the swagger didn't return. His shoulders slumped, his eyes darting between the cowboy and the gathered faces. He wanted to speak, to reclaim his dominance with a well-timed insult or threat. But each attempt died before leaving his lips. Fury and humiliation swirled inside him, hot and pulsing. Yet it was useless against the immovable calm of the man who had stopped him with so little effort. He tried one more time to muster confidence. He raised the phone as if to resume recording or to make some final declaration, but his hand trembled so visibly that even he noticed. With a frustrated hiss, he lowered the device, unable to commit to the performance he had once relished. His cheeks burned a deeper shade of red. He glanced at the cowboy again, expecting to see judgment or triumph, something he could use to justify his anger. But the cowboy only looked at him with a steady, level gaze that neither mocked nor pitied him. It was that unexpected neutrality that broke him. The young man's chest tightened and he stumbled backward, his heel catching on the edge of a chair. He steadied himself clumsily, then backed away further, unable to maintain eye contact. The cafe seemed to shrink around him, its small space suddenly too familiar, too witness-filled, too honest. The room mirrored a truth he didn't want to confront. He had made a fool of himself, and for once no one was rushing to shield him. A murmur rippled through the room, a small, subtle shift of energy as patrons realized he was retreating. The young man clenched his jaw, his eyes flashing with a final flare of defiance. But it was hollow, a last flicker of a dwindling flame. He opened his mouth, searching for a parting shot, but nothing came. The words refused to form, stripped of power in the wake of what had happened. He turned sharply, nearly tripping over his own feet as he moved toward the exit. His steps were uneven, rushed, betraying his frantic desire to escape the scene as quickly as possible. He stormed toward the door, but just before pushing it open, he turned back for one last fleeting moment. His gaze skittered across the room, over the customers, over Doris, and finally begrudgingly over the cowboy. His eyes flickered with resentment, with shame, with the unfamiliar ache of being held accountable. But he couldn't bear the weight of that gaze for long. His eyes dropped, and then he wrenched the door open, the bell above it chiming sharply as he disappeared outside. The door swung shut behind him, and the cafe exhaled as if a storm had just passed. Conversations didn't immediately resume. No one reached for their food or coffee. Instead, there was a collective moment of quiet, the kind that followed a long-forgotten silence. Doris remained standing near the cowboy, her hands still trembling slightly, her breath tight and shallow. She didn't move, didn't speak, still trying to process the whirlwind of events. The cowboy slowly turned toward her. His expression softened just enough to communicate reassurance without needing words. Doris felt tears sting her eyes, not from the humiliation she had endured, but from the sudden and overwhelming sense of relief. The quiet strength he embodied had shielded her more than any physical defense ever could. She swallowed hard and pressed a hand to her chest, trying to steady herself. Patrons began to shift in their seats, some murmuring soft expressions of disbelief or gratitude, others simply watching with wide eyes as the tension in the room eased. A few people glanced toward the cowboy with deep respect, nodding subtly in acknowledgement of what he had done. No applause broke out. No one wanted to cheapen the moment with theatrics. Instead, it was a quiet, heartfelt gratitude that filled the space, something unspoken yet deeply felt. Doris finally found her voice, though it came out as a whisper. She didn't need to say much. The gratitude in her eyes said more than any words could. The cowboy gave a small nod in return, as if to assure her that she was safe, that the danger had passed, that dignity could be rebuilt even after moments like these. The mechanic stepped out of his booth and approached cautiously, as though he were approaching a wild animal he deeply respected. He didn't speak either. He simply reached down to pick up a fallen chair and set it upright. Others followed. Someone wiped up the spilled food, another straightened napkins and menus, and the atmosphere slowly shifted from frozen shock back towards something more human, more compassionate. The cowboy helped Doris pick up a few items scattered near the table, moving with the same quiet grace he had shown earlier. His hands were steady, his expression composed. He didn't seem bothered by the food stain on his boot, nor by the fact that most patrons were looking at him with awe. To him, it was just something that needed to be done. The owner finally stepped out from behind the counter, his voice shaky but sincere as he approached the cowboy. He offered him the kind of gratitude that comes from a place of deep relief. He tried to insist on paying for the cowboy's meal, or offering him a free dessert, or at least letting him take something on the house. But the cowboy simply lifted a hand in polite refusal, his gesture respectful but firm. He hadn't stepped in for a reward. He hadn't done it for recognition. He had done it because it was the right thing to do. Doris watched him with a kind of admiration that she hadn't felt in years. The world was rarely kind to people like her, people who worked long hours, who endured the worst of others' moods, who often went unnoticed. But today, someone had seen her. Someone had protected her without expecting anything in return. The weight she carried felt just a little lighter. The cowboy adjusted his hat and offered a faint smile to those around him. The cafe's atmosphere had already begun to steady, conversations resuming in low murmurs, the clatter of plates returning, the smell of coffee wafting through the air once more. Life was returning to normal, but it was a different kind of normal, a gentler one, touched by the reminder that decency still existed in the world. Without any fanfare, the cowboy stepped toward the door. He paused briefly to glance back at Doris, giving her a subtle nod of reassurance before pushing the door open. The bell chimed softly as he stepped out into the bright morning. And in the cafe he left behind, the people sat a little straighter, breathed a little easier, and carried with them the quiet memory of a moment when justice didn't shout, but spoke in calm, steady actions that needed no explanation. The morning sun lay warm across the storefront windows when the cowboy stepped outside, leaving the cafe behind him. Its glow softened the harsh memory of the scene that had unfolded moments earlier. The bell above the door chimed once, then settled into silence. Inside, the tension that had gripped the room slowly dissipated, unraveling with the steady rhythm of returning normalcy. It felt as though a storm had rolled through a sudden, violent disruption, followed by unexpected calm. The quiet wasn't empty. It was full of meaning, of relief, of unspoken gratitude. Inside, Doris stood still for a moment, looking at the door long after it closed behind the cowboy. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her heartbeat drag itself back to a normal rhythm. Her breath was still uneven, but the trembling in her limbs had begun to fade. It wasn't just the end of fear that steadied her. It was the knowledge that someone had stood up for her without hesitation or expectation. She felt seen in a way she hadn't in years. Not as a worn-out waitress, not as a woman struggling to keep her life stitched together by threads of duty and endurance, but as a human being worthy of respect and protection. Around her, the cafe was slowly piecing itself back together. The mechanic returned to his seat, exhaling deeply as though releasing a weight he hadn't realized he was holding. The elderly couple exchanged quiet murmurs, their hands still entwined. The younger patrons, those who had been more interested in their phones earlier, now looked thoughtful, almost introspective, processing what they had witnessed. The cafe didn't immediately snap back to its usual chatter. Instead, awareness hummed among the patrons, a gentle buzz of shared understanding that something important had happened. The owner approached Doris cautiously, his face carrying an expression equal parts concern and apology. His voice was soft when he asked whether she was all right. She nodded, though her eyes glistened at the edges. He patted her shoulder gently and promised they would talk later about what had happened, about making sure she felt safe working there. His concern was genuine, though tinged with guilt. Guilt that he had stood rooted to the spot instead of intervening. Doris responded with a faint smile, understanding the complicated position he'd been in, even if she wished the world didn't work that way. Patrons drifted closer in ones and twos, not to crowd her, not to overwhelm her, but to offer a nod, a soft word, a fleeting smile. They weren't trying to make up for their earlier silence, but acknowledging it, offering something small, symbolic, because they felt they ought to. It wasn't enough to erase the memory of the boy's cruelty, but it softened the sharpest edges of the moment. Doris accepted each gesture with quiet gratitude, feeling her strength slowly knitting itself back together. She returned to her task gradually, moving through the cafe as though relearning each step. She cleared a few tables, straightened condiments, wiped down surfaces still humming with the echo of what had happened. When she reached the mess near the booth where the young man had sat, she paused. The stain on the floor, the overturned napkin dispenser, the scuff mark from his sneaker, it all felt like a scar left behind. But she didn't flinch this time. She bent down and began cleaning with steady, controlled motions, knowing that even if the cafe bore the memory of the encounter for a while, it would fade. The customers watched her differently now. She no longer blended into the background as a quiet service worker whose presence was taken for granted. Her resilience, her composure, her dignity in the face of humiliation had struck them more deeply than they understood. Even after the fear and tension had lifted, that sense of sympathy and respect lingered. She was not just doing her job, she was reclaiming her space. Outside, the cowboy walked calmly toward the edge of the parking lot. He moved with the same unhurried stride he had entered with, as if the storm inside had not rattled him at all. The sunlight reflected gently on the brim of his hat, casting a long shadow behind him. His boots struck the pavement with quiet certainty, each step an affirmation of who he was. A man who acted when others faltered, not out of pride, but out of principle. The cafe door swung open again behind him. Doris stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron before she realized she was doing it. She hesitated at the threshold for a moment, gathering the courage to speak. She didn't call out. She simply approached him slowly, stopping a few feet away so as not to intrude. He sensed her presence and turned just enough to face her, though he kept his hands relaxed at his sides. For a moment, the two simply regarded each other in the soft morning light. Doris wanted to thank him, wanted to find words that matched the depth of her gratitude, but gratitude that deep rarely shapes itself cleanly into sentences. So instead, she let her expression speak for her. Her eyes, still red at the corners, still carrying the echo of both fear and relief, held a simple, profound sincerity. He nodded once, a gesture that conveyed understanding without needing elaboration. He didn't offer reassurances or platitudes. His silence was a kind of respect, acknowledging her strength without diminishing her experience. And then once more, he tipped his hat in a quiet farewell. The smallest smile touched her lips as she stepped back, allowing him space to leave. The cowboy turned toward the road and continued walking. Doris watched until he had disappeared down the stretch of highway, blending into the hum of distant traffic and sunlight. Inside the cafe, the day slowly regained its rhythm. The sizzle from the kitchen resumed. The bell over the door rang softly as new customers trickled in, unaware of the scene that had just unfolded. The smell of coffee grew richer as fresh pots were brewed. Conversations began to spark again, tentative at first but gradually rising into the familiar undertone of friendly chatter. Yet something had undeniably changed. The mechanic approached Doris once more with a kind nod before returning to his meal. A young woman near the counter asked if she was okay, offering a warm smile when Doris answered. People began behaving more kindly, holding doors, offering help, speaking with softer tones. The memory of the young man's cruelty lingered, but it no longer defined the space. Instead, it was overshadowed by the wave of quiet humanity that followed. Doris returned to her routine with a new sense of resolve. She felt lighter, stronger, not because she had been rescued, but because someone had reminded her that she mattered, that cruelty didn't get the last word. She carried that knowledge with her as she served coffee, took orders, and welcomed new customers. And though the cowboy had left without fanfare, his influence remained. It lingered in the warm glances exchanged across tables, in the soft hum of conversation, in the collective awareness that goodness didn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it walked in quietly, sat in the corner with a cup of coffee, and waited for the moment it was needed. That morning, a man had stepped forward when no one else had. And because of that, a small cafe tucked along an ordinary stretch of highway felt just a little less ordinary and a little more human than it had the day before.